Hello and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a fabulous day today. For the free wire tutorial here on YouTube, I'd like to share with you my Toggle Clasp Cufflinks. Now, I'm often asked about making more jewellery for gentlemen, and this is a really easy way of using up things that you may already have in your stash. So let's head down to the board and take a look at the project we'll make together today. So this is the cufflink idea for today. We're going to be taking a standard toggle clasp finding, and I used this part, the hoop part of the toggle clasp finding, a few weeks ago for a Jessie James beads video, and these products are from their new Coastal Cottage collection, but you probably have toggle clasps very similar to this in your stash already. Now you can of course buy items from finding specialists that are specifically to make cufflinks, and they have a hinged section, but what we're going to do is to create our own using that part of the component. So we'll pop the hoop part of the toggle clasp away for using another day or on another design, and then we'll create this together using the bar part of that toggle clasp. So let's talk quickly about materials. In terms of the size I'm using for my toggle bar, it's about 22mm or just shorter than an inch from end to end, and that's a really good size because it will slip through the buttonhole without any dramas, and it will also kind of hook onto the other side of that buttonhole. In terms of wire, you're going to need two sections that are about 4 inches in length, and we're working with 1mm or 18 gauge wire. You'll also need two sections that are approximately 6 inches in length, again 1mm or 18 gauge. Now these are scraps from my desk, so we will just need to make sure that they're nice and warm. In terms of beads, I've got some 4mm dyed faceted howlite here, and these are just very slightly rondelle. You can go rondelles or rounds, whatever makes you happy, as long as it fits onto your wire. I wouldn't go a huge amount larger than that 4mm size because you don't want to disrupt that buttonhole too much. In terms of the feature bead, I have got a 15mm sea glass inspired pebble bead. You could absolutely use a button or any round flat bead with a good drill hole through the centre. So let's get cracking with the first part of our tutorial. So again, I'm working with scraps. This is a copper coated copper, a non-tarnish. It just shows up really nicely on the camera. The warmer wires really do tend to work in the light. So let's get that nice and toasty warm. Now it's probably slightly longer than we need at 4 inches, but I do like to be prepared. You also do need to have a reasonable length of that little bar, so I've gone for 2 wraps either side and then 3 and 2 on the other section, which we'll get to in a moment, and it just allows the piece to be quite elegant but to hold those cuffs together. You can size that down a little bit, but not on this side because you need that little kind of jointed segment to be useful. So let's slide on our chosen bead. And then what we're going to do is to turn a right angle on one side. So I'm just going to centralise that for now. Turn that right angle up, and then I'll turn another right angle. Now you can have them going away in opposite directions, or you can have one at 90 degrees to the other. It's absolutely up to you. If you're making a great big long rosary link chain, then it does pay to have this at 90 degrees because the chain itself will sit nicely in wear. However, you can have them going in the same direction, opposite direction, whatever makes you happy. So let's make our first little link. And on this side, we're just going to make a closed up rosary link all by itself. So create that round form on the end of the bar and then close that up. Give it a bit of a squish to make it nice and strong. And then what we're going to do is rotate that wire around. Let's start with 1.5 times. That's 1.5 wraps. We've got a long tail of wire to play with, so I'm not overly worried. We'll flip the design over, slide the bead away from the danger zone. You can, of course, use your bail making pliers or your memory wire finishing pliers to get holes that are the same size, but if you don't have those tools, then round nose pliers also work. So on this side, what we're going to do is strengthen that round form up a little bit first, give it a nice little squish, and then we're going to open that up. So exactly like you would open a jump ring, we're going to take half of that circle and just open up that gap. So let's find our toggle clasp bar, slide that down into position, and just snicked it sits in that little round form. You can close that up by hand if you're working with a nice medium copper like I am. If you struggle to do that, then obviously you have tools available to help you. Now, because I've made quite small loops, and that's because I want to just kind of match the other side, you can go slightly larger if you want to, but aesthetically, smaller loops are a bit more advisable. You'll need a second pair of chain nose pliers. So what I'm going to do is to support across that tiny loop without squishing or marring the toggle bar that we're working with, and I might just draw that around by hand to begin with, and if you struggle to do that, again you can use your pliers to help you. So let's match those two sides up first and foremost. So you can see we can probably get another entire wrap on either side. So this is basically, at this stage, it's just a rosary link. So if you're familiar with the rosary linking technique, we're aiming to keep those coils nice and neat and tidy, and then flip around onto the other direction, and let's continue wrapping that tail of wire around in the opposite direction. So once you've gone for a couple of rotations, you'll start to see whether or not that matches up. I've made a slightly unwieldy job of it today, but that's because I don't want to waste your time. So I think I can probably get another half wrap on this side, and then we'll see if I can go for another half wrap on the other side. Push that down. I don't want to put too much pressure on my stone. My stone is a little bit on the fragile side. There we go. And I think if I just very, very softly squish that down, I've got a fairly even wrap. Now, what I would say, like when I'm making earrings, definitely make these both at the same time. So where we're using a 4-inch length, I'd cut 2 4-inch lengths ready to go. And I'd make sure that the distance between those round forms as I'm creating are exactly the same. For me, I think this bar is ever so slightly longer than my demonstration piece because I made this one earlier. So let's trim that away, flip that around, make sure that you're happy with your wrapping, and then back to the scrap pile or the scrap pot you go today. If you're working in precious metals, let's have a look at the overall length. If you wanted to cut a piece of sterling silver or other precious metal to use, probably looking at just shy of 3 inches for this segment using a 4mm rondelle. So I overcut because I've got lots and lots of copper wire, and then as always with that rosary linking, we're going to be very mindful of the bead as we just make sure that the last little bit of wire sits smooth down over that core, taking pains to not crush your beautiful bead, whatever bead you've chosen. Giving that a little bit of a smooth round, and then to finish it off, the wire is coming from underneath over the top and away from me. So I'll just very, very softly rotate my pliers around like so, not scratching my bead. And what that will do is just smooth down that last little bit of rosary linking. I don't think it's hugely different to the first one, but as I mentioned, if you do them side by side, you'll be able to match them much more elegantly. So the first part of the tutorial, we're focusing on just recreating a simple rosary loop. One end is just closed up by itself and the other end encompasses that toggle clasp bar that we've taken from our stash. So in the next section, I'll show you how to safely turn a flat drilled bead into the feature of your toggle bar cufflink. So for the second part of our cufflink, we're going to work with that slightly longer section of wire. And again, this is 1mm 18 gauge, around about 6 inches, and you'll need 2 pieces for this design. So we're going to work with the bead first. Now do just make sure that your wire is nice and smooth and flat. As ever, I'm just working with offcuts from other projects, trying to be as thrifty as possible with a material. So give that a smooth through, make sure it's nice and straight, otherwise your bead might struggle to go on. So at this end, we're not going to need a huge amount of wire, but at this end we need just a little bit more. So allow yourself a good 2 inches on the other side of that bead. You can allow that bead to move around, drop yourself a little right angle to begin with. So what we're going to do is to tie a knot around the back of that design. So if I just flip this over so you can see it, hopefully that will show up on the camera neatly. Because I'm working with glass, what I need to be very sure of is that I'm not going to be putting any pressure on it. Now, some beads love having a little bit of pressure, some beads not so much. So what we're going to do is to take the right angle coming out of one end of that bead, that can slide off if it needs to for now, and just pop another right angle that's slightly deeper than the bead itself, not hugely, so I think that's probably just a little bit larger than I need. So what I'm going to do is just close that up slightly, bring that a little bit closer down. That is much better. So this is the shorter end, that's the wrapping end. So I'm going to just flip the design over and I'm going to put another right angle in. Now the first right angle is easy because you can move the bead away. The second one you just need to be a little bit more careful of, and it needs to come up in the same orientation as the first bend. So what I'm going to do is to just hold on to that bead very carefully by hand, and I'm going to use my pliers to perform the bend rather than pushing the wire up the side of the pliers. So there's a little bit of space outside the bead, push that wire up at a right angle. So it's going approximately in the same direction as the other one. That will be wrapping around in a minute, so it doesn't matter that it's got a little bit of a bend. And then again, we're going to bring that back over the rear side of the bead, trying to match the size of that first one. So it's slightly off angle wise, but that's very easy to just draw them close together, and there's not too much pressure. There's a little bit of movement in my glass bead just to ensure that that's not under any pressure. We don't want it to shatter. So you've got a slightly shorter wire and a slightly longer wire. The slightly longer wire we're going to turn up and away just to the shallow side of central. So the reason I hold just this side, about 1 and a bit millimeters this side of the centre, and push the wire up, is that by the time you've put that bend in, sorry, feisty, that will mean that the angle change occurs centrally on that bead. So you just need to hold those pliers a millimetre or so closer to you. So you can see that one of my angles is slightly off. That's not a problem at all. We're just going to push that so that they now match up. The next thing that we're going to do is to take the shorter tail and wrap it twice around the upright or the core wire. And what we need to be very mindful of is as we're spiraling or coiling this shorter section of wire around that central core, we don't pull too hard on this piece because that will add pressure and possibly fracture your bead. So let's grip across the shorter piece of wire just past that upright. I need to just push that in. So it's just past the point at which the upright comes away from the bead. Push that over the back and you'll see there's the tiniest of gaps. We just bring that slightly closer to the camera, and that is to allow for the wire to then come back on itself. And what we're going to do is to protect that bead and give that a little tiny squish. And what we're doing is we're setting ourselves a nice safety net for that bead. As I said, you can use any bead that you fancy, but I really love these coated sea glass inspired beads for a design like this. So once you have got a really nice strong shape forming around that central core wire, I'm going to turn my pliers so that the curved side goes out down towards the bead and just give that one more very delicate little squish. And that means that hopefully when we start drawing this tail around the core, and again, if you could get the same number of wraps as you have on the second piece that we're making, if I just put that back on its side now. So 3 wraps maybe for me today, I think. So what I'm going to do is to continue very firmly gripping the piece of the wire coming out of the bead that attaches to the short tail. And if I hold that really firmly, making sure I'm not scratching the surface of the bead, if I hold that very firmly, then when I bring the tail of wire around, I won't be pulling that wire over the top of the bead and then risking a little bit of a smash or fracture. So I've gone for 3 wraps, and you'll see that we've kept that distance really nicely because we gripped very, very firmly. So let's trim that tail away neatly, making sure that we do 2 at a time so that they can match beautifully. Now, when I'm tidying this up, I'm going to be mindful that I'm not twisting the wire coil around because I still have a risk of pulling the tail of wire that's attached over here. So let's just make sure that that's nice and neat and tidy. Give that a squish. It does kind of move around in the hands a bit, but that's not a problem. And then again, being mindful not to scratch your bead, especially on a coated bead. Don't want to scratch any of the surface. We're going to give that a nice little tidy up on both sides and make sure that that's close down to that angle change on the back of that long core wire. Now there's a little bit of a tail just here to attend to, so I'm just going to sort that out by very gently opening and closing my pliers instead of gripping that coil and moving around like so, which will pull wire from this end, potentially fracturing your bead. I'm just going to open and close as I turn around, and you'll still get a slightly smoothening effect. So let's pick one of those small beads. Mine, as I mentioned earlier, are 4mm chubby rondelles. I think they look really nicely, having that beautiful flash of blue to represent the almost moonstone-esque coating on these beads. So that all looks pretty tidy to me. So what we're going to do now is grip across that wire, push that away at 90 degrees, leaving yourself enough space for 3 wraps maybe. That looks a little bit long. So you can very, very gently adjust that angle if you need to. Bring in your round nose pliers. And then we're going to attach everything together in just a moment. So I've got my round form on the end. My central core wire is nice and straight. And let's slide that into the loop we made earlier. We'll get that lovely little Wolverine snicked. There it goes into position. And then I'm going to grip across that round form and wrap around, filling that gap. Again, when I'm making pairs of items, if you make them side by side, you're much more likely to get a very perfectly matched pair. This is a little bit larger than my first one. I'm not going to let it worry me today because it's all about demonstrating the technique to you. And again, you will need to tidy up that coil. So let's give that a little bit of a squish, and then we'll contract that coil down so that it looks as neat and tidy as possible. So they're not a perfect pair, but that does demonstrate the overall technique to you of how you can make a pair of cufflinks using a toggle clasp component. So I hope that you have enjoyed the toggle clasp cufflinks technique. These can also be worn as collar pins. If you have those collars that have buttonholes in them, sometimes you get a chain that connects them, which is also another fun design that you can use toggle clasp bars for. These I think are really, really cute. And if you want to see what I did with the rounded section from that toggle clasp set that I had, I made these earrings, and I'll pop a link down in the description. If you fancy giving Jessie James Beads a visit, I've got lots of videos with them and you can check that design out. Thanks so much for watching. Have yourself a beautiful day, and I look forward to seeing you back here again very soon on the Gemhawks YouTube channel.